A general stands before his army, tens of thousands of men, tense with anticipation. The sky is still, the ground trembles not from footsteps, but from the weight of expectation. They've trained, they've waited. Now they look to him for the signal, but he says nothing, not a word. Seconds pass. Then a minute, still silence. The soldiers exchange glances, nervous, confused. Is this hesitation? Is it fear? And then, without a command, he moves, one gesture deliberate, measured, and like a wave crashing without warning. The entire army erupts into motion, every man aligned, every step precise. No speeches, no declarations, just action in that moment. The enemy isn't just outnumbered, they're outthought. They've been waiting for sound, for words, for cues. But the general never gave them one. He gave them silence, because sometimes silence isn't hesitation, it's domination. This is not a scene from fiction. It's a pattern from history, one that repeats itself in kingdoms, boardrooms, parliaments, and revolutions, over and over. Those who speak the least, who withhold, who restrain, who let silence carry weight, often hold the deepest power. Niccolò Machiavelli understood this long before social media and microphones gave everyone a platform. He watched leaders fall, not because they lacked vision, but because they spoke too soon. He observed that power, real power, isn't always loud. It's quiet, deliberate, contained. He wrote not about silence as passivity, but as strategy. To reveal your thoughts is to surrender your leverage. To speak without calculation is to arm your enemies with your intentions. The moment you define yourself, you invite resistance, but in silence, you remain a question, a threat, an enigma. So ask yourself, in a world addicted to attention, where people rush to explain, react, and justify, what happens when you don't? What happens when you stay still, while everyone else scrambles for the spotlight? What happens when your silence becomes the loudest thing in the room? That is the question we explore, from ancient rulers to modern CEOs, from political revolutions to psychological warfare. This is the story of those who mastered the art of saying less, not because they were weak, but because they understood something most people never learn. The moment you speak, you are defined. But when you wait, when you watch, when you let others reveal themselves first, you don't just hold your power, you become it. In a world where speech is seen as power, Machiavelli quietly disagreed. He didn't advocate for silence because he lacked conviction. He advocated for restraint because he understood its value. To Machiavelli, words were not tools for expression. They were instruments of influence, and like any instrument, if used carelessly, they could betray the hand that played them. In The Prince, Machiavelli writes, "A prudent man should always follow in the footsteps of great men, and imitate those who have been outstanding, so that even if he is not as skilled as they are, at least he will resemble them." But what he doesn't say directly, yet implies again and again, is that the greatest leaders were not just brave or ruthless, they were unreadable. And one of the easiest ways to be read is to talk too much. To speak is to reveal. It exposes intent, it locks you into positions, it signals your moves before you've made them. Public declarations become walls. You can't retreat from them without appearing weak. You can't evolve without being accused of inconsistency. The moment your words are out, they don't belong to you anymore. They belong to interpretation, and interpretation can be weaponized. Machiavelli understood this deeply. He watched as leaders in Renaissance Italy collapsed under the weight of their own proclamations, promises made in idealism, declarations spoken in anger, statements that sounded strong but became traps. Cesare Borgia, one of Machiavelli's prime examples of strategic mastery, succeeded not just through violence or alliances, but through ambiguity. He made no grand declarations. He did not explain himself to the masses. He kept his true intentions veiled, even from his closest advisors, and it worked until the moment he lost control of his narrative. This is the essence of speech control. To maintain flexibility, you must first preserve mystery. Machiavelli's writings reveal a subtle but recurring warning. Clarity can be a coffin, especially in politics. especially when others are watching, because once your opponents know your direction, they can lay there traps. Once your allies know your limits, they can manipulate your boundaries, and once the public believes it knows your soul, it will punish any deviation. This is why selective speech is not cowardice. It's calculus. There's an art to saying just enough to pacify fears, to inspire loyalty, to hint at strength, without surrendering your leverage. This is not lying. It's curated ambiguity. Machiavelli, through both The Prince and the Discourses, repeatedly shows that power thrives in uncertainty. A leader who is too transparent creates predictability, and predictability is a weakness. This isn't just a theory. It was Machiavelli's lived reality when he served the Florentine Republic. He was surrounded by factions, spies, papal schemes, and foreign plots. He couldn't afford naive honesty. One wrong word, one overheard opinion, could be interpreted as betrayal. And when the Medici returned to power, Machiavelli's lack of political cover became fatal. He was accused of conspiracy and tortured, not necessarily because he had acted, but because his alleged intent was easy to imagine. He learned the hard way. In politics, the truth doesn't have to be real to be deadly. So in exile, when he wrote The Prince, he sharpened that lesson into doctrine. Be careful with your words. Don't announce your strategies. Don't reveal your whole philosophy. Keep your motives layered. Not exposed. Influence by image, not explanation. This doctrine is echoed centuries later in leaders who understood that rhetoric isn't for clarity, it's for control. Winston Churchill delivered passionate speeches, but kept critical plans. Guarded in silence. Franklin Roosevelt mastered the fireside chat, but behind closed doors, operated with a silence that allowed immense maneuverability. Even modern leaders, whether intentionally or intuitively Machiavellian, know this. The person who says the least, but means the most, commands the room. In contrast, we often see the downfall of those who confuse visibility with strength. Leaders who speak constantly on policy, ideology, or intention create a map for their enemies and a cage for themselves. Machiavelli would argue, let others guess. Let them debate what you might mean. Let them argue amongst themselves about your next move while you prepare it in silence. Because once you become a symbol rather than a sentence, once your power exists in perception rather than prose, you are no longer just leading. You are controlling the narrative without ever having to finish the story. That is not manipulation. That is mastery. Silence at first feels empty, but then it begins to press against the mind. A moment of stillness turns into a question. A pause becomes a judgment. The absence of words becomes louder than anything that could have been said. And that is when it begins to hurt. We are trained from birth to seek answers, patterns, explanations. Language is not just a method of communication, it's our defense against chaos. So when language disappears, even for a moment, the brain panics. It fills the gap with assumptions, with stories, with projections. This is why silence is rarely interpreted as neutrality in conversations, negotiations, or conflict. We do not assume that someone who says nothing has nothing to say. We assume they are thinking something, and that whatever they're thinking must be worse than if they'd just spoken. This is the psychological power of the unspoken in psychology. This instinct is tied to cognitive dissonance, the tension we feel when we can't reconcile conflicting thoughts or make sense of a situation. Silence creates a vacuum where dissonance thrives. When someone doesn't respond, we scramble for meaning. Why are they quiet? What do they really think? Did I say something wrong? The result is emotional discomfort, and discomfort makes us vulnerable. In projection theory, our minds deal with unknowns by assigning them familiar traits. If we don't understand someone's silence, we project our fears or our guilt onto them. We assume judgment, disapproval, or aggression, even if none of that is present. Silence becomes a mirror, but instead of reflecting the other, it reflects us, and that reflection is almost never flattering. This is why skilled therapists use silence as a technique. When A patient spirals into excuses or defensiveness. The therapist may go quiet, not to punish, but to let the patient confront their own discomfort. Often, it's in those quiet spaces where breakthroughs happen, because the client is forced to face thoughts they've spent years avoiding now. Consider interrogation rooms. Trained interrogators know that silence is a weapon, not the loud, aggressive kind, but the slow, creeping kind after asking a loaded question. They say nothing, they wait because the human impulse is to fill the void, and in that rush to speak, people often reveal far more than they intended. The silence didn't extract the truth, it unlocked it in high-stakes negotiations. Silence is used to test control. When one side makes an offer and the other side responds too quickly, it signals desperation, it reveals emotion. But when a negotiator pauses measured, unreadable, the dynamic shifts, the silence becomes a signal. I'm not eager, I'm not vulnerable, I'm calculating. It forces the other party into a state of psychological imbalance, and imbalance, even slight, creates leverage, because when you can't read someone, you hesitate, and in that hesitation, they move. This isn't limited to professional or strategic settings. It operates just as fiercely in personal dynamics. A lover goes silent during an argument, a friend doesn't reply to a message, a parent withdraws emotionally. Each silence sends a signal, but it's a signal that can't be decoded, so we decode it ourselves. And often, we turn it into fear, because we can't measure silence, we can't predict its consequences, we can't manipulate it into submission. This is why silence can feel threatening, far more than spoken anger. Anger is measurable. It's loud, it's visible. But silence leaves you alone with your thoughts, and if those thoughts are dark, the silence becomes unbearable. Machiavelli understood this on a level most people never grasp. He didn't just talk about deception or manipulation. He talked about presence, about the projection of authority, and in his world, a ruler who could not be read was more terrifying than a ruler who was openly cruel. He knew that people will hate a dictator, but they will fear a mystery. When people can't read you, they become cautious, and when they're cautious, they don't plot, they don't provoke, they wait, and waiting is exactly what a strategist wants. Machiavelli believed in cultivating ambiguity, not to confuse everyone all the time, but to create space for maneuverability. If you're always clear, you're always cornered. If your every move is predicted, your enemies begin building countermoves before you've even acted. But when your intentions are obscured, when your words are few and carefully chosen, people can't build a defense, because they don't know what to defend against. And this is where silence turns from discomfort into dominance in group dynamics. Silence from a leader is not interpreted as weakness. It's interpreted as restraint, and restraint, when paired with confidence, becomes charisma. People begin to watch you more closely, they listen harder, they weigh every word you do say. Because your silence has given those words weight, you are no longer just participating in the conversation, you are shaping the emotional environment of the room. This is a kind of power that doesn't look like power. It doesn't boast, it doesn't intimidate, it doesn't threaten, it just is. And because it can't be measured, it can't be challenged, at least not easily, in a modern world obsessed with transparency, expression, and real-time commentary. Silence can feel unnatural, even suspicious, but that only amplifies its effect. The one who holds silence now holds space, and the one who holds space shapes the battlefield. So if people fear what they can't interpret, then let yourself remain partially undefined, because in the realm of psychology, strategy, and survival, the unspoken often says the most. Sometimes, power doesn't come from being heard. It comes from being withheld. The greatest moves in history were often not made with declarations, but with restraint, not with speeches, but with silence. To understand the strength of saying less, consider this moment. George Washington has just led the American colonies to victory over the British Empire. His popularity is unmatched. His army adores him. The nation is his to take, and then he walks away. He resigns his military commission. and returns to Mount Vernon. No throne, no dictatorship, no coronation. He says little, he takes no power, and in doing nothing, he does everything. Washington's silence after the war was louder than any speech. It created a narrative vacuum, an absence of ambition so profound that others filled it with reverence. He was seen not just as a general, but as a myth, a man above power, and that silence gave him more legitimacy than any battlefield ever could. Strategic silence works because it's unnatural. People expect leaders to declare, to control, to vocalize every intent. When they don't, people lean in closer. They begin projecting strength where there may only be discipline. This is how narrative vacuums work. When a leader withholds words, they create space. In that space, speculation grows. People argue over meaning. They interpret silence as wisdom, confidence, mystery, even divinity. And in this space of ambiguity, power multiplies. Barack Obama understood this principle not just as a politician, but as a cultural symbol. During moments of national racial tension, he was often criticized for not responding immediately or emotionally. But what many saw as detachment was actually something deeper, strategic. Quiet. By not reacting to every provocation, Obama allowed the public to reflect. His silence reframed the tone rather than feeding cycles of outrage. He absorbed the heat, then spoke when the timing, the tone, and the framing were fully under his control. He let others vent. He listened to the noise. And when he finally did speak, every word carried more gravity. This is the core principle. Restraint is a form of control. Those who respond instantly lose ownership of the moment. But those who pause, who wait, who watch, they don't just speak, they define the context of the conversation. Now, look to the East. Vladimir Putin is not admired for kindness or clarity. He is feared for his unreadabilities. Public persona is calculated ambiguity. He speaks in measured tones, often trailing off without conclusion. His plans are never fully explained. His motives are never fully known. And so, foreign leaders are forced to guess. Guessing is dangerous. Guessing makes people conservative, and in that hesitation, Putin moves. He doesn't need to be trusted. He only needs to be feared, and silence does that far better than threats. This is not an endorsement of moral ambiguity. It's a recognition of how narrative silence can destabilize entire systems. Because when you withhold your position, your opponents reveal theirs. When you say nothing, people rush to speak, and in that rush, they often expose what you were never meant to know. In the corporate world, this principle is just as alive in high-stakes negotiations. CEOs and corporate attorneys know the value of quiet. When a company is preparing to acquire a rival, the less said publicly, the more advantage they have. Silence buys time. It keeps shareholders calm, prevents competitors from reacting, and maintains strategic invisibility. Only when the deal is done does the message arrive simple, polished, final. This is why corporate missteps often begin with over-communication. Leaders who feel the pressure to constantly explain every fluctuation, defend every number, fill every silence, they dilute their authority. They trade perception for panic because in crisis, people don't want chatter. They want conviction, and conviction often speaks best with few words. Contrast all of this with leaders who failed because they couldn't stop talking. Richard Nixon's downfall wasn't just Watergate, it was the tapes, the obsessive documentation of every word, every rant, every private insecurity. The overexposure didn't just confirm guilt, it erased mystique. People could hear him, they could see him, and in seeing too much, they saw too clearly. They stopped projecting strength. They started detecting weakness. Over-communic isn't just unnecessary in leadership. It's dangerous. It creates targets. It invites interpretation. It gives the audience too much power to define. Machiavelli warned against this centuries ago. A prince who reveals all cannot adapt. A leader who is predictable cannot outmaneuver. A voice that never rests becomes background noise, but a silent figure? They become myth, they become fear, they become strategy itself. Strategic silence allows you to become a mirror, Not a map. A map tells others where you're going. A mirror forces them to confront themselves. This is why the silent leader often seems larger than life, because people are not responding to reality. They're responding to projection, their fear, their hopes, their expectations, and this is power of the highest kind, passive dominance. So, when we talk about saying less to win more, we're not talking about withholding truth. We're talking about mastery over timing. Message and present speech should be rare. Speech should be designed. Speech should land with weight, not frequency. This is the power of restraint in a noisy world. The quiet figure is not forgotten. They are remembered, they are studied, they are feared, because they didn't fill the space with noise. They let the silence speak, and in that space, everyone else revealed themselves. Section 4. Strategic quiet. When saying less wins more. 1,200 words. Sometimes, power doesn't come from being heard. It comes from being withheld. The greatest moves in history were often not made with declarations, but with restraint, not with speeches, but with silence. To understand the strength of saying less, consider this moment. George Washington has just led the American colonies to victory over the British Empire. His popularity is unmatched. His army adores him. The nation is his to take, and then he walks away. He resigns his military commission and returns to Mount Vernon as throne. No dictatorship, no coronation. He says little. He takes no power, and in doing nothing, he does everything. Washington's silence after the war was louder than any speech. It created a narrative vacuum, an absence of ambition so profound that others filled it with reverence. He was seen not just as a general, but as a myth, a man above power, and that silence gave him more legitimacy than any battlefield ever could. Strategic silence works because it's unnatural. People expect leaders to declare, to control, to vocalize every intent. When they don't, people lean in closer. They begin projecting strength where there may only be discipline. This is how narrative vacuums work. When a leader withholds words, they create space. In that space, speculation grows. People argue over meaning. They interpret silence as wisdom, confidence, mystery, even divinity. And in this space of ambiguity, power multiplies. Barack Obama understood this principle not just as a politician, but as a cultural symbol. During moments of national racial tension, he was often criticized for not responding immediately or emotionally. But what many saw as detachment was actually something deeper. Strategic quiet. By not reacting to every provocation, Obama allowed the public to reflect. His silence reframed the tone rather than feeding cycles of outrage. He absorbed the heat, then spoke when the timing, the tone, and the framing were fully under his control. He let others vent. He listened to the noise. And when he finally did speak, every word carried more gravity. This is the core principle. Restraint is a form of control. Those who respond instantly lose ownership of the moment. But those who pause, who wait, who watch, they don't just speak, they define the context of the conversation. Now, look to the East. Vladimir Putin is not admired for kindness or clarity. He is feared for his unreadabilities. Public persona is calculated ambiguity. He speaks in measured tones, often trailing off without conclusion. His plans are never fully explained. His motives are never fully known. And so, foreign leaders are forced to guess. Guessing is dangerous. Guessing makes people conservative, and in that hesitation, Putin moves. He doesn't need to be trusted. He only needs to be feared, and silence does that far better than threats. This is not an endorsement of moral ambiguity. It's a recognition of how narrative silence can destabilize entire systems. Because when you withhold your position, your opponents reveal theirs. When you say nothing, people rush to speak, and in that rush, they often expose what you were never meant to know. In the corporate world, this principle is just as alive in high-stakes negotiations. CEOs and corporate attorneys know the value of quiet. When a company is preparing to acquire a rival, the less said publicly, the more advantage they have. Silence buys time. It keeps shareholders calm, prevents competitors from reacting, and Maintain strategic invisibility. Only when the deal is done does the message arrive simple, polished, final. This is why corporate missteps often begin with over-communication. Leaders who feel the pressure to constantly explain every fluctuation, defend every number, fill every silence, they dilute their authority. They trade perception for panic because in crisis, people don't want chatter. They want conviction, and conviction often speaks best with few words. Contrast all of this with leaders who failed because they couldn't stop talking. Richard Nixon's downfall wasn't just Watergate, it was the tapes, the obsessive documentation of every word, every rant, every private insecurity. The overexposure didn't just confirm guilt, it erased mystique. People could hear him, they could see him, and in seeing too much, they saw too clearly. They stopped projecting strength. They started detecting weakness. Overcommunication isn't just unnecessary in leadership, it's dangerous. It creates targets. It invites interpretation. It gives the audience too much power to define you. Machiavelli warned against this centuries ago. A prince who reveals all cannot adapt. A leader who is predictable cannot outmaneuver. A voice that never rests becomes background noise, but a silent figure. They become myth, they become fear, they become strategy itself. Strategic silence allows you to become a mirror, not a map. A map tells others where you're going, a mirror forces them to confront themselves. This is why the silent leader often seems larger than life, because people are not responding to reality, they're responding to projection, their fear, their hopes, their expectations. This is power of the highest kind, passive dominance. So, when we talk about saying less to win more, we're not talking about withholding truth. We're talking about mastery over timing. Message and present speech should be rare. Speech should be designed. Speech should land with weight, not frequency. This is the power of restraint in a noisy world. The quiet figure is not forgotten. They are remembered. They are studied. They are feared. Because they didn't fill the space with noise, they let the silence speak, and in that space, everyone else revealed themselves. We live in an era of compulsive expression. Post your thoughts, share your story, speak your truth. The world demands transparency. Constantly, we've been taught that honesty equals virtue, that visibility equals authenticity, and that silence is suspicious. But there's a cost no one talks about. Overexposure isn't just noise, it's self-sabotage. The more you say, the more you reveal, and the more you reveal, the easier it becomes to map, manipulate, and dismantle you in the digital age. Every statement is a data point. Every opinion becomes a pattern. You may think you're being heard, but behind the curtain, algorithms are watching. Corporations, political entities, and ideological adversaries aren't just listening. They're studying. They're learning what triggers you, what you fear, what you value. Your voice isn't always your power. Sometimes it's your blueprint. Machiavelli warned of this centuries ago, not through social media, but through politics in The Prince. He observed that rulers who speak too clearly, too often, become vulnerable. Their intentions become known, their plans become predictable, and once people understand your moves, they begin rehearsing your defeat. The more visible your motives, the more targetable your strategy. Look at history's cautionary tales. Julian Assange started as a mythic figure, a digital ghost leaking secrets that governments feared. But over time, through interviews, manifestos, and prolonged exposure, the mystique unraveled. People stopped projecting idealism onto him and started dissecting his flaws. He wasn't defeated by an opponent. He was defeated by definition. He became explainable, and the explainable rarely inspires awe. Overexposure turns mystery into information, and information can be controlled. This is true not only for political dissidents, but for public intellectuals, influencers, and activists. The moment your voice becomes constant, your impact begins to decay. You've given the audience too much access. They stop listening and start evaluating. They categorize, they pick sides, and once they believe they know everything about you, they stop fearing the unknown. They stop listening. Altogether, it's a paradox. We seek relevance through visibility, but the more visible we become, the more disposable we appear, because the human mind craves novelty, but respects rarity. A leader who speaks only when necessary becomes an event. A figure who floods the airwaves becomes background noise. This is why companies like Apple, under Steve Jobs, mastered the art of secrecy. Products were developed behind tightly sealed doors. Leaks were minimal, rumors swirled, and when the curtain finally dropped, people didn't just buy a phone. They bought into a reveal, a moment manufactured by strategic silence. Contrast that with tech companies today who release endless updates, endless previews, endless commentary. Interest wanes, anticipation disappears. The magic is replaced by expectation. Of onum kills mystique even in personal dynamics. This truth plays out. People who overshare online or in conversation might receive empathy, but they rarely command respect. Their boundaries dissolve, their power fades, not because they're weak, but because they've given away every card. Machiavelli would call this a failure of strategy. To lead, to influence, to outlast, you must be more than sincere. You must be unreadable. Honesty has its place, but strategic silence is what builds resilience, not because it hides who you are, but because it protects your leverage. This doesn't mean deception. It means discipline. It means choosing which truths to speak and which to keep, because in a world where everything is filmed, captioned, archived, and dissected, silence isn't absence, it's armor. And for those who wish to move with longevity, to maintain control in a system built to extract and exploit, silence may be the only tool left that still terrifies. So ask yourself, are you speaking to be understood? Or are you speaking to be controlled? Because every word you offer has a weight, and sometimes the most powerful move you can make is none at all. Silence is often mistaken for weakness. People think that silence means nothing is happening, that quiet means surrender, that calm means disinterest. In the minds of those who study power, not just wield it, silence is not absence, it is preservation. It is preparation. It is psychological fortification. It's easy to see silence as a social tactic to remain unreadable, to hold power through ambiguity. But the deeper truth is that strategic silence begins inside, before it is ever a political tool. It is a mental weapon. Throughout history, the most resilient minds didn't just control others, they first mastered the art of controlling themselves, and the first step to that mastery was silence, not outward, but inward. Stoicism, one of the philosophies that shaped Machiavelli's own thinking, is built on the principle of inner calm, not indifference, but clarity. The Stoic does not react to every insult or stimulus. He does not speak simply to feel heard. He speaks when speech serves virtue or strategy. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor and Stoic philosopher, ruled over a vast empire while writing private reflections in silence. Meditations is not a proclamation. It is a man talking to himself, training his mind in stillness, wrestling with ego, emotion, and impulse, not on a battlefield, but in solitude. He didn't need to yell to control. He needed to think clearly to endure. In Zen Buddhism, silence isn't just a break in noise, it's the core of perception. Monks spend years in meditation not to escape the world, but to understand it without distortion. They sit in stillness until thought slows down, until reaction becomes observation, until the ego dissolves enough to see what's real. This is not weakness, it is restraint forged in discipline. Silence creates a space where thought can ripen without interference, where judgment can be suspended long enough for wisdom to emerge, where action, when finally taken, is not reflexive but intentional. Machiavelli, after being tortured and exiled from political life, turned inward, cut off from the republic he served. He didn't seek revenge or attention. He retreated to his study, surrounded by books. He absorbed the strategies of Roman history. He read not to escape, but to fortify. His silence in exile was not defeat. It was gathering strength through insight. Out of that silence came The Prince, one of the most influential political treatises ever written. He did not write it in rage, he wrote it in reflection. This is the core truth. The mind that is constantly reacting cannot lead. It cannot predict, it cannot adapt. It becomes hostage to the emotions of the moment. In contrast, the silent mind observes it, sees the emotional chessboard for what it is, recognizes manipulation and avoids it. It recognizes fear and manages it, recognizes opportunity and waits until the timing is right. Think of Nelson Mandela locked away. For 27 years he wasn't shouting, he wasn't posting, he wasn't giving interviews, he was watching, listening, learning, becoming indestructible from the inside out. When he emerged, his presence carried the weight of decades. Because silence had made him unshakable, the prison didn't break him. It revealed what could never be broken. Now, contrast this with the world we live in today. Modern culture celebrates noise. Every platform rewards reaction. Every headline provokes outrage. Every moment invites commentary. Silence in this world looks like absence. But what if silence is not withdrawal but defiance? In a culture built on instant expression, silence becomes an act of rebellion. A refusal to be baited, a refusal to perform, a refusal to outsource your attention. Span to algorithms that profit from your distraction. Mental privacy, knowing what you think before the world tells you what to think, is rare. It's not something you get, it's something you build. Strategic silence is the process of reclaiming that privacy. It is emotional minimalism. It is the discipline of not speaking when silence will do more, not responding when the ego demands validation, not acting when waiting will yield clarity. Because if you can remain still while others panic, if you can remain quiet while others beg for noise, if you can remain unknown long enough for your moves to unfold uncontested, then you are no longer part of the game, you are the edge of it. The enemy of every manipulator is the person they can't provoke, and the silent person, the one who thinks before speaking, who moves only when necessary, is unprovocable. Can't control someone who controls themselves, and that's what makes psychological fortification so rare and powerful. Silence protects the mind from leaking energy through unnecessary words. It protects emotion from hijacking reason. It protects strategy from being exposed before it matures. It protects identity from being co-opted by noise. This doesn't mean isolation. It doesn't mean disengagement. It means deliberate restraint. It means saying what needs to be said, not what wants to be said. It means pausing before the reply, so that the reply isn't just true but useful. It means allowing discomfort to rise in silence, because that's where real clarity lives. In ancient temples and modern war rooms, the pattern repeats. The most powerful minds are not the loudest, they are the quiet ones, the ones who hold their words like a blade, not a drum, the ones who let others exhaust themselves in noise, then step forward, clear, sharp, unshaken. Because silence isn't the absence of response, it is the presence of control. And in a world built to overwhelm, provoke, and extract, control is everything. We live in the noisiest moment in human history. Every second, someone is tweeting, posting, streaming, shouting. Platforms reward immediacy. Algorithms amplify outrage. People speak not to connect, but to perform. Vulnerability is curated. Opinions are weaponized. Silence, once a sign of reflection, is now treated as suspicious. Be quiet is to be guilty. To pause is to fall behind. The pressure is constant. Speak your truth. Share your story. Stay relevant. But beneath this flood of digital noise, something strange is happening. The more we speak, the less we're understood. The more we share, the more exposed we become, not in a freeing way, but in a dangerous one. We've confused expression with freedom. But expression without restraint isn't freedom, it's erosion. We've created a culture that rewards compulsive openness, yet the cost is rarely acknowledged. Careers have been destroyed by a single poorly timed tweet. Influencers have vanished after revealing just a little too much. Activists have been discredited not by their enemies, but by their own oversharing. In the age of algorithmic surveillance, every word is permanent. Every comment can be sliced, recontextualized, turned into ammunition. The line between authenticity and self-destruction has never been thinner, and the system thrives on this vulnerability. Social platforms are not neutral. They are designed to extract attention, amplify conflict, and reward extremes. They encourage us to narrate every moment of our lives while quietly building profiles, categorizing our behavior, predicting our decisions. We think we are being seen, but in truth, we are being mapped over time. This architecture turns us into predictable participants. We stop thinking independently. We speak when we're triggered. We react before we reflect. We perform because performance keeps us in the feed. Silence becomes rare and therefore dangerous in this world of performative noise. Machiavelli's voice returns, not as a relic, but as a warning. He never said truth was worthless. He never said silence was always superior. What he understood was something sharper, that words should serve power, not replace it. In The Prince, Machiavelli doesn't encourage endless talking. He encouraged deliberate messaging. He reminds us that the perception of power is often more effective than the display of it. That mystery can breed respect, while overexposure invites scrutiny and rebellion. He lived in a time of spies, factions, and brutal political reversals. He saw that to speak carelessly was to die carelessly. And while our modern stakes may not always be as dramatic, the psychology remains unchanged. To speak without strategy is to lose leverage. To share everything is to give your enemies the map to your vulnerabilities. To respond to every challenge is to become predictable. Today's noise makes ancient wisdom look radical. It says, don't post every emotion, then react to every insult. Don't explain yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. Resist the pressure to narrate every chapter of your life. Let people wonder what you think. Let them guess where you stand. Let them fill in the gaps, because in those gaps, you control the story. There is power in absence, presence in restraint, and above all, there is freedom in not needing to be constantly perceived. Strategic silence is not cowardice. It's clarity in a world that demands your constant expression. Choosing silence is not just resistance, it is a revolution, because the quieter you become, more you begin to hear who you really are. Power has a voice, but it also has a silence. Not all influence needs volume. Not all control requires visibility. And not all strength demands that you speak. There is a kind of influence that doesn't arrive with fanfare. It doesn't trend. It doesn't ask for attention. It waits, it observes. And then, at precisely the right moment, it acts, and when it does, it changes everything. Throughout this journey, we've explored the philosophy of restraint. We've seen how Machiavelli understood that silence was not a void, but a weapon, a boundary, a message that refuses to be shaped by the expectations of others. Because silence is not emptiness. Silence is format, is the deliberate shape you give to your presence when everyone else is demanding your participation. It is the outline of discipline in a chaotic world. The problem today is not that people have nothing to say, it's that they say everything. Before they've decided what it means, they mistake speech for action. They confuse reaction with clarity, and in that confusion, they give themselves away. They offer the most valuable thing they have, their intentions, to systems designed to twist, repurpose, and profit from them. You were not meant to be constantly heard. You were meant to be carefully understood, and understanding cannot happen in noise. It cannot happen when your thoughts are hijacked by the urgency of response. It cannot survive in the speed of performative engagements. So what do? You reclaim the pause. You begin to treat silence not as absence, but as communication. Not as retreat, but as presence. You begin to ask, what do I actually want to say? And more importantly, what does the world not deserve to hear from me yet? Because everything you speak becomes currency. It becomes part of the system, and the system never forgets. Moment you give your thoughts away too freely, they no longer belong to you. They belong to algorithms, to audiences, to interpretations. that will never understand the context in which they were born. Machiavelli warned us long ago. To lead is not to explain. To lead is not to confess. To lead is to calculate when your words build bridges and when your silence becomes a fortress. Isn't about deception, it's about sovereignty. The quiet leader isn't hiding. They're guarding what matters. They're refusing to let the world write their story before it's ready, and in doing so, they become unpredictable, unreadable, indivisible. It's easy to speak when everyone's shouting. It's easy to join the noise, but it takes strength to pause, to observe, to let the storm pass while you remain rooted in stillness, because that stillness speaks. It speaks in how long you wait before responding. It speaks in the tension your presence creates. It speaks in the way others watch you, not knowing what you'll do next. It speaks in their discomfort, and that discomfort, that's your leverage. The world isn't just listening to what you say, it's listening to when you speak. And if you've built your silence carefully, patiently, then when you do speak, every word will carry the weight of restraint, of thought, of presence. Your words will not be echoes. They will be event. That is the language of silence. It's not quiet for quiet's sake. It's not withdrawal. It's not fear. It's awareness sharpened into stillness. It's power that doesn't need applause to exist, because true influence isn't declared. It is felt in the space you refuse to fill, in the conversations you choose not to enter, in the thoughts you hold until the moment they can't be ignored. The most dangerous person in a room isn't the one who dominates the conversation. It's the one who listens, the one who watches, the one who doesn't need to be seen, because they already know what they're looking for. And so, as we close this journey, ask yourself this: if the greatest minds in history, rulers, philosophers, warriors, learned that silence could protect their power, clarify their purpose, and preserve their presence, then why do you keep giving your voice away so freely? What would happen if you stopped explaining yourself? What would happen if you waited until the moment was undeniable? What would happen if you let your silence carry more meaning than your words ever could? The world may never teach you this, but Machiavelli did. And now, leave a comment. What part hit closer than you expected? Or better yet, what truth did you feel before you could name it? If this made you think of someone walking their own uphill road, share it with them. Because in a world addicted to performance, it's the quiet conviction that cuts deepest. Stay grounded, stay unreadable. Until next time.